So tonight is session 3 of Marriage and Family Counseling, Communication and Intimacy. So when we look at a biblical theology, usually when someone comes for marriage counseling, they're going to have what we call a presenting problem. And what they're going to describe for you are the symptoms that they're dealing with and struggling with and trying to overcome. But the root of those problems are going to be invisible to them. Each person in a marriage has an underlying set of ideas, even expectations, if you will, about what marriage ought to be and how it's supposed to work. And what we call this is practical theology of marriage. And again, practical theology is different than philosophical theology. Philosophical theology is what the Sunday school answers. This is what I know it's supposed to look like. But the practical theology is how I really live it out, what motivates me, what I'm looking for, what I'm driving for. So each of us as biblical counselors also have our own theology of marriage. And that's going to be a significant factor in how we approach counseling couples and on a more extended basis, families together, which is why we're doing the kind of reading we're doing so that our theology of marriage is far more biblical than it was when we started. We spent the first couple of weeks really trying to lay that foundation. How we can teach that to others, how we can pass those things along to others through counseling. We talked last week a little bit on gender matters, about the significant differences between men and women, and they're there by God's design, not just generally, but even specifically in specific couples. We talked about how men and women are generally different, but sometimes you'll find couples where those usual differences are switched in them, but God has brought them together. So even though there's those differences between them, God has woven those two people together with those differences, and they're woven together well. But if we don't understand those basic differences and learn to be in tune with them when we see them, when they're identified, we're not going to be able to help people well. Because as we talk about often, it's really easy to see different as wrong. But it isn't. Different is merely different. And we have to give God some credit for intending that to be there. Now, that doesn't mean, that there's not room for improvement in character or maybe even habits, but those aren't necessarily prideful sin problems. And often couples will say, we just don't know how to communicate. There's so many other things going on, but ignorance and pride are usually the main obstacles you're going to see to godly communication and authentic intimacy in marriage. When we talk about intimacy, we're not talking about the sexual intimacy. That's only one small part of intimacy in a marriage. The ignorance part is really pretty simple to address. We can educate pretty well, pretty easily. But God is the only one that can deal with the pride part. So we have to say, okay, we're going to educate them. We're going to point out things that this seems prideful, but we're going to have to pray that God humbles that person. So let's talk a little bit about communication. Like I said, poor communication seems to be the number one complaint when couples get into trouble. Now, granted, couples often don't communicate or miscommunicate. But the question is why? Why does that happen so often? Sometimes they say, well, we just need to learn to communicate better. Well, do you need a better skill set? Maybe. But maybe there are other problems underlying this that are coming out in the communication breakdown. Maybe there's other things going on underneath. So one of the conversations that I had earlier today with a counselor about a counseling situation, we were talking about assumptions, presumptions, perceptions, judgments, and decisions. I hope somebody wrote that down because I'm going to try it again. I did not write this down. So it starts with assumptions, which leads to presumptions, which are based on our presumptions, which leads to perceptions, which leads to judgments, which leads to decisions. So this actually grew out of a conversation in hermeneutics class the other night. If I come from a family that makes sure that meat is part of every meal, no matter what it is, okay, my underlying assumption is that that's good and right and normal, and that's how everyone else lives. Okay. So my presumption is my spouse is going to have the same view, right? So when my spouse says, "Oh, I don't like meat," my perception is there's something wrong with her. So my judgment is going to be a negative judgment of her. I'm going to think that there's something wrong or broken or sinful or something with her that has to be addressed or fixed. Okay. So the decisions I'm going to make are going to often be antagonistic. Do you see the progression? And a lot of times when we see breakdown in communication, especially with a couple, you have these underlying assumptions and expectations even of what that person is supposed to be like, how they're supposed to treat you, how they're supposed to communicate, all those things. So we've got these underlying presumptions and perceptions that are faulty, inaccurate, and then we have these expectations that are not only unrealistic, they're unwarranted. So that's going to make solving problems extremely difficult, which means that if we can't solve problems, we're going to have a lot of conflict. And if we have a lot of conflict, we're not going to be able to resolve that conflict or go through it biblically. Then we're not going to be able to make good, sound decisions together. And as far as expressing appreciation or love toward each other, that's not even on the radar. So a lot of times you'll have a couple come and sit down, and both of them usually are hurt, angry, bitter, fearful, sometimes just confused. I don't know what's going on. But you've got all these powerful emotions that are influencing them, not just impacting them personally, but how they see their spouse, how they understand or view the problems, and what possible solutions there might be. Well, if she would just, or if he would just, I can't even tell you how many times I've heard that. And we know from, like we talk about in Unbound, you got these expectations, they go unmet, you're disappointed. Disappointment builds. You hold on to it. You don't resolve it. You don't forgive it. You don't surrender it. Okay. That disappointment becomes disillusionment. Now I'm disillusioned with not just with the person, but the relationship. And then I'm going to start to become despondent about it. Well, this is just a mess. Well, maybe I married the wrong person. Then we resent the fact that God didn't stop us, somebody didn't stop us somehow, and we very quickly can end up in bitterness. All starts with those unmet expectations. Now, not all expectations are unreasonable. Thing is that even though they're not unreasonable, we still need to surrender them. Because if we don't surrender the expectations, we're not able to extend mercy and grace to the sinner we're married to, that we covenanted with, to love, honor, cherish. One of the things that's very interesting is to ask a question and watch how they talk it through. Not interrupt, not engage, just sit and watch and listen. It won't take very long for their culture of communication will show up. They can try to be on their best behavior for a minute, but once their emotions start to kick in, emotions really start to get engaged in what's going on. It's what I call, they have like a relational accent. If you grew up in Alabama, you're going to talk like you're from Alabama, and you may be able to concentrate on enunciating clearly. But when you get all excited, it just goes away, right? That's what happens with couples often. Now, sometimes you'll have one in particular who's really easy, or really got it down, keeping it under control. But if you wait, they're not going to be able to maintain that false control. If they're going to have a conflict that you're going to help them navigate through and help them find ways to resolve it, having it happen in a counseling setting is something we need to not shy away from. It's like when we do role plays. We do role plays to give you an opportunity to practice counseling situations working with a net, right? You're not going to break somebody in a role play. So you're kind of creating that kind of a situation in a counseling environment. We have to remember that they may come in talking about, well, we can't communicate, or we just don't seem to be able to resolve conflict, or don't seem to be able to do conflict well. Those are just the pimples on the face, right? Emotional acne. There's stuff going on underneath that is causing that. And this is just what's showing up on the outside. And that's what we're going to be dealing with. Just like in any counseling situation, we want to get to the heart of the matter. Okay? But remember, one of the key things about them being in conflict with each other is that being a reflection of the conflict in their relationship with God. Not just individually, but as a couple. Because remember, a Christian marriage is one that has Christ at the center of it. You know, a threefold strand is not easily broken, right? So we're going to look at a little bit of a case study, and the details of this have been altered, but kind of go along with me. So Donna and Lisa are in their late 20s with no children. Both are college educated. Donna's a successful businessman, and Lisa is currently amid a career change. They've been married 5 tumultuous years. Both are professing Christians, reared in Christian homes, and involved in their local church. They've sought and received counseling off and on from numerous pastors and other counselors throughout their marriage. 5 years. Though they found it helpful in resolving some difficulties in the marriage, their basic pattern of relating remained unchanged. Don's ideal picture of marriage involves spending time together, sharing thoughts, dreams, ideas, and feelings. Now, we would often say, well, that sounds like a female. Okay, but not always. In this marriage relationship, Don was the one that had a hunger for those things. He craved social and sexual intimacy and desired to spend time talking with his wife and being romantic. Growing up, Don felt alone much of the time as his parents were not very affectionate or attentive to him as a person. He remembered spending a lot of time by himself, wishing things would be different. Don was drawn to Lisa because she was assertive, attractive, talkative, and attentive. He finally felt connected to someone and felt loved. Early in their marriage, however, intense conflict and arguing shattered this picture. He longed to share with Lisa deeply and from his heart, and he desired encouragement and support from her. Instead, he found himself frustrated and hurt when she would present opposing views or disagree with him, or was distracted with other tasks and her own career goals. Lisa failed Don's expectations of what a loving wife ought to be. He continually struggled with deep disappointment in marriage and with Lisa. He felt she did not understand him or his needs, and often ignored him out of frustration or lack of real caring. Lisa stated that she loved Don and wanted to be close to him, but was afraid of him now that he had become violent. Oh, wait a minute, now we got a whole other factor in here. Don's angry outbursts confused and hurt Lisa. She didn't understand what her husband wanted of her. After several hurtful conflicts, she became afraid to express her opinions and differences, so she withdrew. And we call that learning to cower quicker. You just shut down and you pull back, and you're going to do everything you can to neutralize even the perception of conflict. She also felt that he wanted her to listen and understand him, but he offered little of that toward her. Growing up, Lisa was the oldest and had a lot of responsibility in the home. She was a high achiever and a hard worker. She received a lot of praise for all the work she was able to accomplish, and sometimes felt irritated with Don's neediness, as she would call it. Oh, how often I've heard that language. Lisa also had an eye for the good life, pleasures, and possessions. Now, in much of their previous counseling, they dealt with the dynamics of their expectations and the resulting quarrels. During the worst of these quarrels, a regular pattern of low-grade physical abuse by Don toward Lisa would emerge. Despite much counseling over these issues, there was little change. Lisa hated when Don would slap or spit at her when he got angry, but never believed that these episodes of physical abuse were severe enough to warrant physical separation. However, she withdrew emotionally and sexually. After cooling off, Don always felt extremely remorseful and would ask Lisa for forgiveness. At the time they came for counseling, the hitting and spitting episodes had escalated. Don was desperate to stop this behavior. He knew it was wrong, felt very convicted about it, but he couldn't seem to get his behavior under control prior to having an outburst. So during our first session together, it was obvious that Don felt remorse and embarrassment for his behavior. Maybe it's just regret, not true remorse. As I gathered data, I asked him about his relationship with God and the way God convicted him of this behavior. So he stated emphatically that he knew it was sin and it had to stop. Even though he knew this intellectually, he continued to become physical when his anger had risen sufficiently at Lisa. And remember, we get angry at, not with people. He was at his wit's end. And so toward the end of the session, I asked him two things. First, I asked if he was willing to be accountable to an elder or pastor of his church for the hitting and spitting episodes. I thought it important to have external constraints placed on Don regarding his anger. The embarrassing consequences of having to call the pastor might serve as a gentle reminder to remove himself from an escalating situation. He agreed to do this. Second, I asked Don if his conscience ever convicted him of sin while he was in a conflict prior to striking or spitting at his wife. He looked at me incredulously and said, I don't think so. So as a next step, I asked that he begin praying that God would have his attention before he lost control of himself. I suggested to him that God was not merely there to provide forgiveness after he sinned, but God would help him prior to the outburst. This case study is to illustrate the many decisions that we as counselors constantly make during the counseling process, and to shed light on ways that we influence the outcome of the session. One clue that I use to know when I'm at a fork is to listen carefully for certain key statements. Here's an example of a key statement. It didn't work. What didn't work? I tried to communicate my feelings and be honest with Lisa about myself, but she wouldn't listen. So here's a critical juncture. As mentioned previously, the key phrase is, it didn't work. I've been working with Don to communicate his feelings and concerns with Lisa in a calm manner in order to please God and enhance her willingness to listen to him and not withdraw. Now, one path a counselor could take at this juncture would be to turn to Lisa and ask what was going on with her, her expectations, her feelings, thoughts, etc. In essence, why wasn't she listening to Don? This would address the two-way breakdown of communication, but instead of taking this path, I chose to stay with Don, attempting to find out what there is about him that drives him to the point where he eventually loses his temper. So she wouldn't listen to you. Then what happened? She just acted like she didn't care and wouldn't hear my point of view. What did you want? Emphatically, I wanted her to understand me, to show just a little concern for me. Then what happened? I felt hurt and angry. She was being so insensitive to me. Do you hear all the assumptive language in all of that? I'm sure it was painful to be rejected when you really want her to listen. So tell me, what kinds of things were you telling yourself at this time? What was the internal monologue going on in your brain? I don't know, marriage stinks. Lisa will never be the kind of wife that I hope to have. I can't stand that she won't listen to me. And what happened next? I just got angrier and more hurt that she wasn't listening to my feelings. I eventually lost it and slapped her. I spit at her. Afterwards, I really felt bad and ashamed. I left for a couple of hours. Later, I came home and apologized to her. And one of the things you have to understand too, that I didn't put in here, I would often tell a spouse, male or female, if the other spouse is getting physically striking them, that's why God created 911. We may really need to get the local magistrate involved, because we've got a crime being committed, not once or twice, but repeatedly, even in an escalating manner. And sometimes the only thing that is going to interrupt that enough, instill the fear of God in someone, is getting the local magistrate involved. So just so you're aware, there are other things happening in the conversation that aren't in the notes. So here's another critical juncture for the counselor. There's a three-way fork in the road. The first path be to examine and comment on Don's sinful behavior of arguing, slapping, and spitting at Lisa. In addition, it could also examine Lisa's arguing and lack of understanding. Exhortation and instruction to put off arguing, fighting, and put on love would be one logical and biblical choice, a la Ephesians 4. I could teach specific biblical conflict resolution techniques. For example, the difference between making an apology and seeking true forgiveness, without exploring the roots of angry behavior. But Don and Lisa had heard, read, and even tried these as techniques with no lasting change. They most definitely needed to learn godly ways of resolving their conflicts and to put off sinful and selfish behaviors and attitudes. But underneath these behaviors and attitudes were ruling desires that needed attention first. Because remember, the desires of our heart are what drive. And if the desires of our heart are not good, godly, loving, what our mind is going to seek to do is satisfy the desires of the heart. And if they're not godly desires, the outcomes are going to be ungodly. They needed to make peace with God before they could make peace with each other. Second path I might take would be to work with both Don and Lisa simultaneously. Look at how they set each other off. Don's frustrations often result from things that Lisa was or was not doing, and vice versa. A cyclical pattern of interaction could be observed and mapped out by the counselor. We could devise strategies for breaking into this pattern and assign them to the couple as homework. For example, a timeout procedure could be agreed on to prevent escalation. We call it the safe zone. At times, this type of intervention is very appropriate for couples, especially when the issues of their heart have already been identified. They're both working toward individual change. However, in this case, at this time, Don still blamed Lisa's lack of understanding for his continued momentum towards a temper out. I chose a third path. Don needed to see what ruled his behavior and attitudes during the conflict, independent of Lisa's behavior and attitudes. So in fact, Lisa's noncompliance with Don's desires served to magnify and justify Don's insistent and idolatrous cravings. It's tricky in any type of counseling when the object of the unmet desire is a legitimate, even biblically sanctioned ideal, and the lack of it results in suffering or even a perception of suffering. It is God's will that my spouse be loving toward me or submissive to me, etc., is the heart cry of many counselees. Lisa's coldness and preoccupation hurt Don. Don's tantrums hurt Lisa. It's difficult for the hurt counselee to see how our desire for a good thing, a warm, supportive wife, a peaceable, generous husband, becomes a sinful ruling force and an inordinate craving, replacing God and spinning out ugly behavior. Let me see if I understand what happened. You felt really upset when you tried to share some important feelings with Lisa and she was uncooperative and uncaring in her approach and attitude toward you, right? You felt angry, sad, hurt, and you tried to share this with Lisa in a calm manner. And you felt it didn't work because of what? Because she didn't understand. It didn't matter how calm or nice I tried to say it. She still didn't really understand me. So you wanted her to really understand you and care for you, right? Yes. And these eyes kind of filled with tears. I can see that's painful. What happened when you began to realize you weren't going to get what you really wanted from Lisa? I got angry. No, I got furious. And then what? I guess that, listen to this minimizing language. I guess that's when I just lost it and slapped her and spit at her. Stay calm. What were you feeling and thinking at the moment? I don't know. I was just so angry and sad. I just want a wife who will care for me. Do you see the impersonal language? I want a wife. Not seeing her as a person, not seeing her as the wife, a wife. Sorry, I need to not just run commentary. Am I asking for too much? I hate when she argues with me and won't answer me. I can't stand it. She's not being a godly wife like that. So you felt hurt and angry that Lisa was, again, not being the kind of wife that you felt you needed, or more importantly, that she should be. Is that right? That's the moment when you lost it and hit her. Yeah, I was just so hurt and mad. I know it was wrong and I felt awful afterwards. I'm sure you did. So let me ask you a question, Don. What is more important to you, getting what you want, especially if it's a good thing, or being godly? Well, what do you mean? Well, wanting Lisa's understanding and caring is important to you and not wrong or sinful in and of itself. In fact, it is desirable and good. However, when it didn't happen and you felt hurt, you took it as a justifiable reason for your anger, resulting in losing your temper and slapping and spitting at your wife. What do you think God's opinion is about a man who abuses his wife? He hates it. Oh, he does hate it, that's for sure. More than that, however, God has some of the most terrifying things to say about his attitude toward those who oppress and abuse others. It seems to me that your want became a demand, and you were willing to live in a godly way with the hurt, unwilling to live in a godly way with the hurt of not getting what you desired. You exploded at least because you wanted your way more than you wanted God's way. What do you think on that? What about her? Ooh, set me sideways. That's one of those questions I hate. Doesn't she have any responsibility to meet my needs? Yes, God calls her to love you. But the real question here for you is this. What happens to you when Lisa sins and harms you by not doing that? How are you going to handle this? How can you treat her with understanding the way you want her to treat you? How do you trust God with your hurt at her self-preoccupation? How can Jesus become more of a reality for you so you can extend forgiveness and find help in the moment so you can bear this pain in a Christ-like way? Well, this did lead to a major breakthrough for Don in getting a handle on what motivated his anger, self-pity, and confusion. He was convicted of his appetite for understanding and romantic attention. He clearly saw his need for experiencing Christ's love more fully. They had much to learn about communication skills and conflict resolution. However, these in and of themselves would only partially address the problem this couple faced. Don needed to understand that his ruling wants, his craving to be understood and loved on his terms, produced anger and rage. And we look at that in James 1:14 and 4:1. What causes wars and fightings among you? You crave for and do not get what you want, and you become murderous. At the point where he did not get what he wanted from his wife, her selfish reasons notwithstanding, he exploded. His anger and self-pity felt totally justified in the heat of the moment. Abusive behavior came from his sinful heart. He already knew that his abusive behavior was sinful, and he often repented, in quotes, afterwards. But he now became aware that his idolatry, Lisa must love and understand me in order for me to be happy, had usurped God, becoming more important to him than I need to love God with all my heart and soul and love my wife as myself. As this came into focus for Don, he was able to repent for what generated his abusive behavior. He learned that his wife's lack of understanding only exposed his demanding heart. It did not cause his sin. We have to remember, even if somebody responds sinfully to us, it can be a catalyst for our sin, but it doesn't cause it. So through Christ, he could learn to love Lisa and to respond even to her sin with love, not wrath. This renewal of mind enabled Don to become more aware of his heart's condition and Christ's love during marital stress. He began to learn to handle disappointment in a God-honoring way. As he learned to express his hurt to Lisa without all the rage and anger, this helped free Lisa to examine her own heart as to why she was unwilling to love her husband in ways that blessed him. Prior to understanding that, she was able to conveniently justify her behavior because of her fearfulness. So after this breakthrough, Don was ready to learn biblical communication, conflict resolution skills to better serve his wife and their marriage. What if counseling had focused on these prior to understanding Don's ruling motives and helping him find Christ? He might have become a more skilled self-server, even more manipulative, using his new improved skills to manipulate his wife to love him better and meet his needs more fully. So for the purposes of the case study, Dawn is held center stage, but Lisa had her own set of sinful motives that ruled her attitudes and behaviors as well. She'd always received praise for attaining high performance goals. She was performance-oriented and strived at perfection in everything she did. This consumed much of her time, leaving her exhausted and uninterested in interpersonal time with Dawn. She just wanted to have a good time, food, fun, socializing, not heavy conversations. She wanted to enjoy the good things of life that money could buy. She found it difficult to trust that Don was interested in her as a person when he was preoccupied with what she could do for him. She looked for affirmation from Don by doing. She felt very hurt when he was disappointed in her as a wife. She didn't know what to do to make him happy. And the more she withdrew, the more Don became angry. The more Don became angry, the more she withdrew. Seeing these motives and patterns was a painful process for Don and Lisa. Dying to self and learning the love of Christ is tough. Paradoxically, Christ says that when we lose our lives for his sake, we find life. Don and Lisa needed to see how their hearts had turned in subtle ways from loving God and each other to serving themselves. Identifying these issues was the first step. Deeply repenting of them was the next. As these self-centered roots were exposed to the light of God's word and the grace of God's forgiveness, the foundation was adequately prepared for biblical instruction and practice in loving communication and conflict resolution. So we're going to pause there in this part and open it up for discussion from you guys for a few minutes. So one of the questions, or one of the parallel questions, I guess, or a pair of questions we got, I don't know how to phrase it, but is why can't she, or why won't he something? You ever heard that or ever wondered that yourself? You hear it you hear it often. So we're going to talk a little bit more about gender differences. So we're going to talk about some things that are generally true, but not always true, not even necessarily true. We need to be prepared to run into exceptions, but at the same time, know that most of the couples we counsel will fit the descriptions that we're going to walk through. The four we want to talk about. First is men and women are motivated differently. Men and women process life differently. Men and women experience love differently, and men and women experience intimacy differently, generally. Okay. So men are motivated by succeeding at conquering. Women are motivated to succeed relationally. We often say that men get their primary sense of worth and value from what they do and how well or how poorly, where women get their sense of worth and value from the uh, health of their relationships generally. For men, having a task set before them and be able to see that they accomplish the task gives them a sense of worth and value. Women, on the other hand, get their sense of worth and value from the quality of their relationships. Understanding this difference is key for couples who desire to be able to understand and be understood by their spouse. So remembering that um, um, one of the things that you'll hear is he'll come home from playing golf, or he'll come home from the gym, or whatever. And she says, so did you hang out with Peter? Yeah, I did. How's he doing? Oh, he's fine. Now, she knows that Peter's wife has been sharing some struggles that they've been having with their oldest son. Okay. Well, did Peter share that with her husband or not? Well, did he say anything about, oh, yeah, he mentioned it? Well, did you ask him this? Did you ask him that? So she's all pursuing all the relational stuff. And he's like, no, and so he's not even thinking along those ways. And I've heard this over and over and over and over again. I run into it in my own marriage. My wife will say, well, what about this? I'm like, you're asking me questions I have no answer for, because I didn't even track down that. I didn't even go down that track. Well, why not? I just didn't happen to think down those lines. Nothing bad or wrong, right? Just different. 2, men and women process life differently. Generally speaking, men process internally while women process externally. What this means is that men will most often think things through, saying little or nothing until they reach their conclusion. And then they will proffer what they think about a situation or problem. So here's what I come up with. Ta-da. Women, on the other hand, are often unclear on just what they think or feel about something until they hear themselves say it. I can't even tell you how many times I've heard women say that. Even if they know that what they're saying is wrong, they have to get it out in order to see it clearly in the context of everything else that they think and feel. So it's about, how does everything else tie together and relate to everything else? And it's a jumbled mess, it's so jumbled I can't sort through it. But if I get it out here and hear myself say it, so it's kind of like, thinking out loud type of thing. A second key difference is that men easily compartmentalize life, while women deal relational with life. A man will open one box, deal with the context, close the box, move on to another. Do not open more than one box at a time. This creates confusion and fear, and they will react strongly as a result. And I remember one young couple that I'd known them since before they met. I've been part of their courtship, had done their wedding, did counseling with them, early marriage counseling, some difficulties. And then they had 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, then 5 kids. Well, they're getting ready to move. I mean, they got the 5th kid on the way. They've got to move into a bigger home. So they're getting ready to go through the garage and start packing stuff up and sorting stuff. He called me up in a panic, says, I do not know what to do. I'm freaked out. I'm angry, and I don't know why. I said, well, tell me what's going on. He says, so we agreed to divide the workload in the garage. She was going to take half. I was going to take half. Right? So we're working about an hour, and I walked by where she was to go to the bathroom, and she's got everything scattered everywhere. So she's looking through all of the totes and boxes simultaneously, sorting through it. He's going through one at a time. Well, that represented chaos to him, and really unsettled him. She was able to keep track of everything. He got lost just looking at it. Women, everything in life relates to everything else pretty easily. They can do more than one thing at a time and do it well, or rapidly switch between things. They easily connect a string of events with each other. Husband, on the other hand, experiences a dumbfounded confusion when his wife brings elements into discussion or argument that seem totally unrelated to the case at hand, at least from his perspective, this is so. So a lot of times he's like, I don't know what that has to do with what we're talking about. And he'll get so focused on his confusion, he's not listening to what else she's saying. So now you're not paying attention to me. Anybody ever experienced that at all? No. So, and again, this isn't always the case, because sometimes I've seen couples where this was absolutely reversed, where she liked everything neat and tidy, everything systematic, structured. She felt safe and comfortable and at peace with that. And he was the one that was more chaotic. Okay. Well, like I'm saying, these are generally so. Men and women experience love differently. As Ephesians 5:33 insightfully shows us, men feel most love when they feel respected. Women feel most love when they are loved. For a man, being scolded, ridiculed, scoffed at, mocked, disregarded, spoken ill of, and things of this sort all communicate disrespect, which he equates to being unloved, because that makes him feel like he's not lovable. So admiration and affirmation speak respect. That's why I often tell wives, I said, look, if you will affirm him, you don't have to worry about him getting puffed up or prideful, unless he really is narcissistic. He's already, easily beating himself up. I said, but if you affirm him, say something like, I know this is a difficult decision, and I trust that you are seeking God on this, and you and God are going to come up with the right decision, and we can talk about it. Or I really appreciate how devoted you are to providing for the family. Affirming. I appreciate how helpful you've been. What I say, it will cause his chest to rise just enough that he's not going to get puffed up, but it'll elevate him enough to say, yeah. And he'll drive himself into the dirt to live up to that affirmation. Because generally speaking, not always, but generally speaking, a man can start his own business selling stuff out of the trunk of his car, build it into a multi-billion-dollar multinational corporation, and still every morning when he sits behind the CEO's desk, there's a part of him that suspects that if someone were to come and say, you're a fraud, you don't belong there, he would agree with them. There's just this built-in uncertainty. So he doesn't need any help with that. But at the same time, if a woman isn't listened to, isn't being consulted, not being treated as an equal though different, being spoken harshly to, being used by someone to have that person's needs met, all contribute to making a woman feel unloved. Tenderness and care speak love to her. Men and women experience intimacy differently. Men often confuse sex and intimacy. Sex and intimacy are not the same thing. Sex without intimacy can be very unrewarding, just as sex with intimacy can be deeply passionate and fulfilling. It is also possible to experience intimacy without sex. And to a lot of men, it's like, what? Because they equate the two together. It doesn't create intimacy for a man, but what it does is it proves to a man a bit, yes, I've experienced this sexual intimacy that proves that I've been intimate. Women, on the other hand, experience intimacy when they feel safe, and safe enough to honestly and openly share whatever is on their heart without threat of rejection, ridicule, or condemnation. Men need this to feel respected, but women are unable to be sexually intimate if emotional intimacy isn't provided first. That's why the old saying that sex begins in the kitchen. Women naturally, by God's design, or naturally and intuitively understand God's design for sexual intimacy to be at the far end of the intimacy chain. Right? It's the ultimate expression of intimacy between two people. For a man, sex can be on the front end because, okay, that means I've been intimate and they're good to go. that can change over time as they learn to understand that intimacy doesn't just mean sexual intimacy, as they learn to appreciate conversation and relationship and warmth and closeness without the physical sexual component. So let's talk a little bit about intimacy. Intimacy is the experience of emotional closeness. So when two people are able to feel safe, to be emotionally vulnerable with each other, to share what their thoughts, their emotions, their fears, their desires, all of that are with each other without threat, without a sense of being at risk. That is intimacy. But that can't occur unless both people are able to trust each other and able to take that risk of being vulnerable with each other, that naked and unashamed. It's a universal human need. That's what God created us for, was intimacy. Without it, we experience isolation, loneliness, eventually worthlessness. And a lack of godly intimacy is actually one of the most common reasons for relational breakdown. So the lack of godly intimacy is going to be at the root of the communication problems. So the word intimacy comes from a Latin word that means innermost. So in a marriage relationship, what that means is open, honest, authentic, vulnerable sharing of innermost thoughts, innermost feelings, innermost desires, innermost fears, innermost who I really am. And both men and women need to feel secure in sharing those things and confident in their spouse's acceptance and support, even if that support isn't fully accepting at face value. I understand what you're saying, and I appreciate you sharing that. It concerns me a little bit because of this. Even that is a safe way, or can be a safe way. So support is achieved through listening, empathy, through prayer, and through reassurance. Okay. So generally speaking, this sharing and support must be in place before a woman will share herself physically in sexual closeness. She can physically be engaged, but she can't physically and emotionally be engaged very well. It's not true intimacy. So what men mean by intimacy often, deep physical connection, foreplay, hand-holding, hugging, kissing, that physical connection, understanding each other's physical needs, an ability to communicate physical needs, physical time alone together, a sensitivity on her part to know when he has physical needs. Needs ought to be in quotation marks because they're not always. Remember, something that's a legitimate need is something without which you will suffer harm. Okay? And there's no recorded case anywhere of anyone suffering harm from not having sexual intimacy. So it's not really a need. It's just a very strong desire that can feel like a need. What women mean by intimacy is deep emotional connection, daily time sharing your heart, daily time hearing the heart of the one you love, ability to cry easily and together at emotional moments, a sensitivity to know immediately when feelings are hurt, understanding each other's dreams and goals, closeness to the heart and soul. See, these are broader things. These are more personal things. For a man, men have a tendency to be more functional and more comfortable with functionality. So being able to say, look, my husband's different in this way. My wife is different in this way. So how do we understand each other and how do we respond to each other's makeup? So when we say, why can't she or why won't he? Well, let's take a look at the basic makeup of the two of you as man and woman, and let's see what kind of foundational differences might be driving this. Two key verses, Genesis 2:25, the man and his wife were both naked, but they were not ashamed. In Genesis 3:7, the eyes of both of them were open and they knew they were naked, so they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. There's nothing so unromantic as love, authentic love. Romantic feelings of attraction and pleasure will sometimes be associated with love, but the essence of love is different. The essence of love is a commitment to act for another's welfare. And we look at love biblically, it's a passionate desire for God's best for another person, even at great cost for yourself, more than you want it for yourself. Love also gives without expectation of return. Okay. So some key principles. The foundation of God's relationships with us is the covenant relationship that we see in Isaiah 62, 3-5, Hosea 2, 19 and 20, and Ephesians 5, 30 and 32. The covenant is a binding relationship till death do us part that brings God and his people into a permanent relationship with obligations and blessings for both. God, Christ, is the groom, and we, the church, are his bride. In the two texts we looked at, understanding nakedness, what it represents, and why it is such an important component of the human experience, especially marriage, is going to be a cornerstone for understanding of communication and intimacy in marriage. So we see nakedness first introduced in Genesis 2:25. They were naked and were not ashamed. And it's an important element in the next part of the story because nakedness conveys a number of things. In the Genesis account, Genesis 2:25, it signifies innocence, authenticity, integrity, and not just trust, but ease of trust. Trust was a natural part of it. Neither the man nor his wife had any fear of exploitation, no sense of fragile vulnerability, no risk of being hurt or harmed. However, as soon as sin enters the picture, nakedness takes on a negative significance. And from that point on, it is usually connected with a sense of helplessness, shame, risk of exploitation, and exposure, the uncovering nakedness that we see throughout the rest of the Old Testament refers to sexual exploitation or captivity and war. So some key principles we want to look at. One is sin divides people. Sin puts enmity, animosity between us and God and us and our fellow man. Up until that moment, when Adam and Eve had sinned, there was no animosity, no enmity, no sense of being enemies between them. Everything was balanced, harmonious, mutually caring, nurturing, filled with authentic love. But once they'd sinned against God, all those things were lost. Not completely, but they were so marred and mangled that they were elusive. I can't find it. It's here somewhere. So sin separates the sinner from God. It separates the sinner from their neighbor. It separates the sinner from themselves. It deceives and it shames. Sin causes the sinner to feel a compelling need to hide and blame instead of being honest and confess. Think about how hard it is to tell on yourself. If somebody's telling on you, even if it's face to face to you, our tendency, sinful tendency, is to resist that and try to make it look another way or not so bad or like it's not there at all. This is what happens in a marriage when one or the other spouse sins. Their relationship with God is hostile. That's the enmity. And it'll bring hostility into the marriage, even if it doesn't become obvious right away. We have to remember that sin is not invisible. It's not invisible to God, and it's not invisible between humans for very long. Because sin destroys. Even if it's gradual like rust instead of rapid like a fire, it still deteriorates and destroys. It's corrosive. Self-centered craving that we see in James 4, 1 through 3. Those 3 verses are really intended to get each of the quarreling parties to take an honest look at themselves. So when James says, where do the conflicts and where do the quarrels among you come from? He doesn't say, well, you need to understand that the reason you're fighting is because the other person is difficult and stubborn, because it's genetic, or because a demon of anger has taken up residence, because of generational sin, because core needs are not being met, because you don't know any better. Instead, he lays the blame directly at the feet of those who are fighting. He says, you lust, and think of that as an idolatrous craving. You lust and do not have. You murder and envy and you cannot obtain. You quarrel and fight. Sure, it takes 2 to tango, but who are you involved? Or why are you involved in the dance? That's really what the question is. The word translated lust, epithumeo, it means to passionately crave or covet. So it's a self-centered craving. Think of it as a gluttonous craving, right? You feel entitled, you expect your wants to be met, when and by whom and how you want. And when those expectations go unmet, it causes a passionate craving that we feel entitled to have met at the expense of others. And when this is played out in marriage, instead of loving our spouse as we love ourselves, we love only ourselves, or mostly ourselves. So our spouse's wants, needs, and even what they are due from us that we promised, or what God expects of us, all get sacrificed on the altar of the worship of me. Third is the grasping demand described in James 4, 11 and 12. My will be done, and woe to you if you cross me. My way or the highway. You guys have heard that language, right? So the scripture looks at the underlying things that drive personal conflict, and it's profoundly revealing from Genesis through the rest of Scripture. What it helps us see is that when we're critical, when we're nitpicking, when we're condemning, when we nag and condemn others, we're sitting as their judge, and we're playing God. And sitting in God's place is actually one of the most heinous sins of all. But it's one we will call all kinds of things other than what it is. Our tendency is, because the original sin was a desire to be worthy of worship, and the battle that we see of the sexes described in the judgment oracle of Genesis 3 is that each of them will seek to be the one most worthy of worship. That's what the conflict is about. So our tendency is to establish these mini kingdoms, these mini fiefdoms in our lives, and set ourselves up as a self-righteous judge. And so we weigh everyone by our self-established system of oughts. And one of the trickiest ones can be, well, I have a view of myself and I'm right about that. That's where self-righteous comes from. So I am a good husband. So anything my wife says or does that indicates that she doesn't agree, or might make other people think that I'm not really the good husband that I know I am, I'm going to judge her for, I'm going to condemn her for, and I'm going to punish her for. Because I have a view of myself and I'm right about it. She better not cross me. We won't say that out loud, but this is where we end up. So we charge those people with offenses against our crown, and we'll confess their sins for them and convict them of failing to properly worship us. Within the marriage relationship, this becomes a battle of the gods that no human can win, because we're not really gods. Not only do we end up living in a stark and consistent disobedience to what God has commanded us, but we also live in gross betrayal of the vows we made. This basically makes us idolatrous traitors, don't you think? And when both parties in the marriage fall into this trap, they become two trains rushing headlong toward each other on the same track. That is not going to turn out well. Then we have broken down truth. The result of all of this is that we make an enemy of the one human being we most need to be our friend and ally, and the one we committed to be the number one friend and ally of. Covenant of companionship. Malachi describes it in Malachi chapter 2. We fight against the person and not with the person. We feed the problem and defeat our friend. This I need, this I crave, this I must have, this you must supply. What is really at work is that our expectations are for God to bless us the way we believe we're entitled to be blessed. And he is supposed to use the person we're married to accomplish that. So our problem really isn't with our spouse. It ends up being really with God. And every broken down horizontal relationship is a reflection of a broken down vertical relationship. Remember, we've talked about that often. The health of our horizontal relationships reflect the health of our vertical relationship, like we were talking about Don and Lisa earlier. They both had a broken down relationship with God, and that was reflected in how they related to each other. Both of them had sin responses. Yes, Don's were more sinful in many ways because of the harm they brought, but both were sinful responses to each other. So for married couples, and of course the families that are part of their relationship, this actually creates a demonic agenda, not a godly agenda. We become the accuser of God's people. We take up Satan's agenda against those who are God's image bearers. This puts us at war against God, not just against the person we think our conflict is with. So God's remedy is grace and truth. James 4:6 tells us that God gives more grace and he gives it to the humble. It's important to note that the word rendered opposes, God opposes the proud, is a military term, and it means to marshal forces. So God marshals his forces against the prideful. So when those who've been playing God speak the truth and confess it, the God of all grace restores and renews, cleanses the angry, fearful, critical, bitter, and prideful. And he establishes them on good ground of the gospel of Christ. I love that. When you've suffered a little while, the God of all grace will himself restore, renew, and establish you. So instead of marshaling his forces against the prideful, now that the person is humble, he pushes the hosts of heaven out of the way and he says, I'll take it from here. So just as we see Jesus' truth personified in John 14:6, and just as we see in 2 Corinthians 5:10, we have to take every deceived way of thinking captive and bring it into submission, obedience to the truth, which is Christ. And as biblical counselors, our role is to help our counselees understand these things from God's perspective, and then prayerfully help them seek to exchange lies for the truth by discovering God's truth and then surrendering their ideas to that truth. And then we guide them along the path of giving and receiving forgiveness and then walking that out. And then the approach is 1 Thessalonians 5:14, a verse that you guys are very familiar with by now. In light of that verse, we need to see not only what we're dealing with in the counseling situation, but the who of the problem. And it's so easy to miss out on that. Like we're talking about shepherding a child's heart. We can look at the problem and not the person. Are we working with the rebellious? Are we working with the fearful? Are we working with the weak? If the counselee is rebellious, they need to be brought to the place where they can recognize, admit, and repent of that rebelliousness. Also understanding that the key issue is between them and God, not them and their spouse. If the counselee is fearful, we need to uncover the faulty belief system that causes them to believe their doubts more than they believe what God proclaims. And then we replace the lies with the truth via scripture saturation. Two verses you're very familiar with, Romans 8:6 and Romans 12:2. And that's the primary homework to employ. If the counselee is weak, unable to do what they know God commands, then they need to be discipled and provided opportunities to practice and develop the skills they need to walk in loving obedience. Remember that when what we lust for is replaced by God-given desires and priorities, communication opens up, intimacy can be experienced, and the things that we're fighting for naturally flow from the wellspring of God's created order. We're fighting for what God wants us to fight for. We're not fighting against our spouse, we're fighting alongside our spouse, actually fighting for them. God does grant grace to the humble, and he does oppose the proud in a warlike manner. So it's really up to us which aspect of God's character we're going to face. So that's all I have on the lecture part for this evening.